The storm had arrived quietly, with no warning beyond a breath of wind and a subtle shift in the air. The kind of storm that didn't scream, didn't thrash, but whispered. The rain came down like soft fingers brushing across rooftops, drumming faintly against the weathered wooden cottage tucked at the edge of the forest, far from the sound of cities and the chaos of days. Inside, the light was low. Alara sat curled in her favorite chair, a thick knit blanket around her shoulders, its scent of cedar and home long infused into the fibers. The fire flickered gently in the hearth, casting warm gold onto her skin and making the shadows on the walls dance like old memories come back to visit. Her hair was damp from earlier, her tea cold on the small table beside her. She wasn't reading anymore. Not really. The pages of her book had stopped turning some time ago, and now her gaze lingered on the window, watching the raindrops chase each other in erratic lines. Her breath was soft, slow, thoughtful, waiting. Outside, the trees swayed with the breeze, leaves rustling like whispers in a language only nature understood. The world had quieted in a way that felt deeper than usual, not just the hush of nighttime, but a heavier stillness, like the universe had paused just long enough for something to happen. And then, it did. 3 soft knocks at the door. Alara's head turned instantly, heart skipping a beat, not from fear, but recognition. She stood slowly, not hurried, as if her body had expected this moment even if her mind hadn't dared to hope. Her bare feet moved across the wooden floor, the planks creaking beneath her, each step echoing like a heartbeat. She reached for the latch with trembling fingers and opened the door. He stood there, drenched, his dark coat soaked through, hair dripping onto his cheeks, eyes shadowed by the storm, but unmistakably him. The man she hadn't seen in more than a year, the man whose memory had haunted every quiet corner of this place. Calum. He looked up at her with a gaze that carried so much: exhaustion, warmth, longing, and something else, something fragile and unspoken. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a breath, deep and low and familiar in a way that tugged at the edges of her soul. "I wasn't sure if you'd still be here." She didn't speak, couldn't speak. Her throat tightened around words she hadn't prepared. Instead, she stepped aside. He walked in without question, shedding his coat and hanging it on the old iron hook by the door. The air changed the moment it closed behind him. The rain was now a background lullaby, and the space between them, once infinite, felt too small to contain everything they'd left unsaid. He stood near the fire, palms out to warm his fingers, though his eyes were on her, always on her. "It smells like lavender," he said softly. "Still." She nodded, arms wrapped around herself. "You always liked it." Silence lingered, not uncomfortable, heavy but meaningful. Then he moved toward her, slowly, like approaching a skittish bird. No sudden movements, just soft footsteps and open intentions. He stopped only when he was close enough to reach out, but didn't. Not yet. "I kept thinking," he said, "about this room, the fire. You sitting here, legs tucked under you, your hair like this. I kept hearing your voice when I couldn't sleep." Alara swallowed. Her voice returned, but it was small. "Then why didn't you come back sooner?" His eyes faltered, just for a moment. "Because I was afraid you'd moved on, that I wouldn't belong here anymore." She shook her head. "You never stopped belonging." He stepped closer. The space between them vanished in a breath. He lifted his hand to her cheek, brushing away a strand of hair that had fallen across her face. His touch was feather-light, the back of his knuckle grazing her skin like it was made of silk. She didn't flinch. Her eyes fluttered closed for the briefest second, a sigh caught between her lips. The night had thickened around them, folding the cottage into its silence. Outside, the storm continued to breathe softly through the trees, its rain a lullaby tapping rhythmically against the windows, like gentle fingers coaxing the world to sleep. The fire in the hearth crackled with slow-burning certainty, throwing warm flickers across the room and deepening the shadows that curled into every corner like sleeping thoughts. In the middle of it all, Alara stood in Calum's arms, her face tucked softly into his chest, his heartbeat calm and steady against her ear, as though he had never left, as though the months between their last kiss and this one hadn't nearly broken them both. He didn't speak, not yet. There was too much to say, and no need to say any of it. His hands rested lightly at her waist, warm and strong, not gripping, only holding. Elara felt the heat of him through the thin cotton of her shirt, the way his breath changed when she shifted just slightly closer, her cheek brushing against the curve of his neck. He tilted his head, lips finding her hair again, another gentle kiss placed just behind her ear. Nothing urgent, nothing taken, only given, as though every kiss was an apology and a reminder all in one. She closed her eyes at the feeling, her hands slowly flattening against his back, sliding up and down in lazy strokes, like relearning the shape of someone she'd never really forgotten. "Do you still think about that night?" he asked finally, his voice a husky whisper, his lips so close they brushed her skin with each syllable. Elara nodded slowly, not pulling away. "I think about it more than I admit to myself." A quiet beat passed, stretched and still. He leaned back just enough to see her eyes, his fingers moving from her waist to trace the line of her jaw. She looked up at him, eyes shimmering in the firelight, soft with memory and ache. "I never stopped wanting to come back," he murmured. "I just didn't know if you'd wait." "I didn't know if I should," she whispered back, her voice nearly caught in her throat. "But I did." That was all it took. He bent toward her again, but this time his kiss found her cheek, slow, warm, a lingering press that made her breath hitch. Another followed, lower now, near the corner of her mouth. She turned her head just slightly, eyes fluttering closed, and the space between their lips closed like the pause at the end of a sentence. His mouth touched hers in the gentlest kiss she had ever known. It wasn't a kiss that demanded anything. It didn't beg forgiveness or ask for promises. It simply existed, quiet and sure, like rain on a quiet morning, or the hum of firelight in the silence. Elara felt the way his lips molded to hers, soft, slow, full of reverence, and she kissed him back just as carefully, her hands lifting to cup his jaw. He exhaled against her mouth, a low, broken sound, as though he'd been holding his breath for months and had only just remembered how to let it go. The kiss deepened, not by force, but by closeness, a slow and seamless merging of hearts that had wandered too long without each other. When they finally parted, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, eyes closed. He held her for a long moment, saying nothing. Then quietly, he took her hand and led her to the couch by the fire. They sat side by side, her legs tucked beneath her once more, and he wrapped the blanket over both of them. The world outside faded even further, the storm a quiet echo behind the cocoon of warmth they now shared. He leaned back against the cushions, arm open, and she tucked herself beneath it, resting her head on his chest, hand slipping across his stomach. His fingers stroked her shoulder, slow and rhythmic, like waves against the shore. "You changed your hair," he said softly, his fingers brushing it back from her face. "You used to wear it longer." She smiled faintly. "I cut it the week after you left. It felt like something I could control." The storm had passed in the hours between midnight and dawn, slipping away as quietly as it had come, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt sacred. The cottage was wrapped in that hush now, the kind that follows the rain, where the trees hold droplets like pearls, and the sky breathes in hues of early gold and silver. The fireplace had burned down to a faint orange glow, its light casting sleepy warmth across the rug. The air was cool, but not cold, the kind of cool that invited closeness, skin against skin beneath thick blankets. Elara stirred first. Her eyes opened slowly, lashes fluttering against the curve of Kylem's shoulder where her head still rested. The steady rise and fall of his chest was a rhythm she'd forgotten she missed. He was still asleep, his body curled around hers like a shelter, one arm loosely wrapped across her waist, the other beneath her head. His scent, cedar, rain, skin, was richer now, warmer, woven into the fabric of the blanket and the slow breaths that left his parted lips. She didn't move, not right away. There was something sacred in this stillness, something she didn't want to disturb. But her fingers found their way to his chest anyway, tracing lazy, near-invisible shapes into his shirt. She could feel the quiet strength of his heart beneath her palm. Slow, steady, peaceful. She remembered the way he'd kissed her forehead the night before, the way he'd whispered her name, like it was the only word that ever mattered. She hadn't known how much she needed that sound until she'd heard it again. Her name in his mouth was no longer just a sound. It was a promise unspoken. Caleb's breath hitched slightly, not startled, just stirred. He murmured something low and incoherent, his voice gravel-soft from sleep. His arm tightened gently around her waist, pulling her a breath closer, and she felt his nose press lightly into her hair. "You're still here," he whispered groggily, a sleepy smile curving at the edges of his voice. "I thought maybe I dreamed you." Alara tilted her face upward, her cheek grazing his jaw. "You talk in your dreams," she murmured. "You said my name, twice." "Good," he breathed, eyes still closed. "I was afraid I'd forgotten how it tasted." She chuckled softly, and the sound made him open his eyes, heavy with sleep and warmth. His gaze met hers, quiet and deep and unguarded in the dim light. He lifted his hand, fingers brushing her temple, then sliding back to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch lingered there, his thumb sweeping gently along her cheek. "You look beautiful like this," he said. "Like you belong in mornings." "Mornings don't usually look like this," she replied, her voice a soft smile. "They do when you wake up next to someone who makes silence feel like a song." He leaned down then, not rushed, not planned, just drawn to her the way the sea pulls the moon closer with each tide. Their lips met in the softest of morning kisses, warm, slow, barely there, like a secret. She kissed him back with the same kind of tenderness, her hand rising to rest at his neck, fingertips playing with the ends of his hair. Their mouths moved in perfect rhythm, not exploring, not taking, just greeting. Like their bodies remembered something their minds were still catching up to. He kissed the corner of her lips next, then her cheek, then a trail of soft, whispered kisses down to the curve of her jaw. Each one was like a breath, a heartbeat, a memory returned to life. Alara closed her eyes and breathed him in. There was no urgency in their closeness, only a quiet hunger, not for touch, but for presence. They lay like that for a while longer, tangled beneath the blanket, sharing soft kisses, lazy strokes of fingertips across exposed skin, and little pieces of their hearts they didn't know they were still carrying. The mist clung to the trees like memory, soft, weightless, lingering. A pale morning sun filtered through the high canopy of branches above, painting patches of silver light along the forest path. The air smelled of damp leaves, pine, and something faintly floral that Alara couldn't quite name. She and Caleb walked side by side, hands entwined like vines, their fingers occasionally brushing as if they were rediscovering the language of touch. Neither of them spoke much. There was no need. The silence between them had transformed from tension to tenderness, and every glance, every step, every breath felt like a page being gently turned in a book they had both stopped reading too soon. Alara wore a long, soft-knit sweater over her nightclothes, her feet tucked into worn boots, and her hair loosely tied back in a ribbon she didn't remember grabbing. Caleb walked beside her in the same shirt from last night, sleeves rolled up, collar rumpled. He looked at peace in the quiet, his gaze soft as it moved through the fog, as if seeing this place through new eyes, or maybe through the eyes of someone who had never stopped dreaming of returning. She watched the way the light kissed his jaw, how his thumb kept tracing slow circles over the back of her hand, how his shoulders seemed to relax more with every step they took together. "I forgot how it smells here," he murmured at last, voice low and deep, like the trees themselves were listening. "It smells like rain and earth, and something warm." Alara looked up at him. It's rosemary. There's a patch of it by the creek. I planted it the week after you left. He glanced at her then, his expression softening further. Was that for me? She gave a tiny shrug, the corner of her lips lifting. I think it was for the part of me that still believed you'd find your way back. I needed the scent to remind me you weren't completely gone. They stopped beneath an old elm, tall, wide, its bark carved faintly with initials from years ago. Kylam reached out and ran his fingers over a pair of letters hidden behind a veil of moss. This, he said, smiling. I remember carving this. Your hands were freezing. You were holding hot tea and trying to stop me from misspelling my own name. Alara laughed softly, and the sound drifted between the branches like music. You didn't misspell it. You just wrote the E backwards. Which you kissed and said made it even more perfect. She nodded, her fingers brushing the carving beside his. I did, and I meant it. He turned toward her then, gently cupping her cheek in one hand. His thumb rested just beneath her eye, as if he were memorizing the curve of her face. Can I kiss you here? He whispered. She nodded without hesitation. You never have to ask. Still, he did it slowly. His lips met hers with the softness of morning dew on petals, warm, lingering, full of meaning. Her hand slid up to his chest as she leaned into him, the world falling silent around them once again. Their kiss deepened, just slightly, just enough to feel like the answer to a question neither had dared to ask out loud. When they parted, he stayed close, their noses nearly touching. You know, she whispered, I used to walk this path alone, every Sunday morning, just to remember what it felt like, to wait for you. His forehead leaned gently against hers. And I used to walk city streets, thinking about this path, thinking about your voice calling me home. They stayed like that, breathing in one another's air, surrounded by the scent of wet bark, wild rosemary, and something that had lived too long in the space between longing and hope. Alara stepped back slightly and took his hand again, weaving their fingers tightly together. There's a clearing just up ahead, the one where we first... Her voice drifted, her cheeks warming. You know, Kylam's smile deepened. I remember every second of that day. You wore that ridiculous oversized sweater. The path home felt shorter with Kylam beside her, their steps synchronized, like they had always walked this way together. Alara's fingers stayed wrapped in his the whole time, their touch unbroken, comforting. The mist had begun to lift, the forest slowly waking beneath pale sunlight, but inside her chest, the stillness remained. Calm, warm, full. She glanced at him from time to time, watching the way the breeze brushed his hair across his brow, the way he kept glancing at her like he was making sure this wasn't a dream. It wasn't. This was real. He was here. And with every quiet step, every little glance, every shared smile, it felt more natural, like he had never left. Back at the cottage, the door creaked softly as they stepped inside. The fire had faded into glowing embers, and the air was cool, crisp with morning. Alara gently removed her sweater and hung it by the door, her eyes flicking toward Kylam, who had already started tending to the fire without a word. He moved like he belonged here, his hands careful, practiced, setting fresh logs, coaxing new flame from what was left. She stood quietly behind him, watching the glow come to life, lighting his profile in gold. There was something about the way he existed in silence that made her breath catch. I'll make tea, she said softly. Kylam looked over his shoulder and nodded. Do we still have that honey from the wildflowers? Last jar. I was saving it. He stood and walked toward her slowly, taking the teapot from the shelf before she could reach it. Then let's use it today. This feels like a honey kind of day. Alara smiled at him, warm and lingering. It does. The kitchen was small and quiet, with sunlight now streaming gently through the window over the sink. As the kettle warmed, Kylam leaned against the wooden counter, watching her with lazy appreciation. Alara moved slowly, methodically, her fingers around the ceramic mugs, the delicate clink of the teaspoon stirring. She could feel his eyes on her the whole time, and though no words passed between them, the air was filled with a kind of charged silence, soft and glowing. When the tea was steeped and poured, she carried the mugs back to the hearth, where the fire had bloomed back into life. Calum sat cross-legged on the thick rug, his back resting against the couch, and he looked up at her with a smile that felt like an invitation. She sank to the floor beside him, their knees brushing, and handed him his mug. Steam curled between them, carrying the scent of rosemary, mint, and honey. For a moment, they drank in silence. Then Calum broke it with a low murmur. "It's just like I remember. The way it tastes. The way you hold your cup with both hands like it's fragile." She turned to him, lifting one brow, amused. "It is fragile. I broke the last two." He chuckled, reaching out to brush a loose curl behind her ear. "Still, it's endearing." She took another sip, the warmth spreading through her chest. The fire crackled softly beside them, casting amber light on their faces. Calum leaned closer, his mug now resting on the floor, and Alara mirrored the movement. Their shoulders touched, their knees pressed together. The closeness was slow and steady, building like a tide, unhurried but inevitable. He spoke again, softer now. "I can't stop looking at you." Alara's cheeks flushed under the warmth of the fire and his gaze. "I feel like if I blink, you'll disappear again," she admitted. "You won't wake up alone," he said simply, brushing his thumb across the back of her hand. "Not anymore." Her mug found the floor next to his, and she turned toward him fully, her legs folding beneath her. "How do we start over?" she asked, not with fear, but with quiet hope. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he lifted her hand and kissed the inside of her wrist, slow, reverent, his lips lingering there like he was breathing her in. She felt her whole body soften at the touch, her eyelids lowering with a quiet exhale. They returned to the cottage in a slow kind of silence, the kind not born from lack of words, but from a mutual reverence for the shared air between them. The path home was quieter now. The birdsong had softened, and the trees stood still as if listening. The rain had left its mark in shining puddles and glistening leaves, and the forest smelled fresh and clean, as though it too had been washed of old sorrow. Calum held Alara's hand the entire way, their fingers laced tightly, palms warm. Now and then, he'd brush his thumb across hers, an absent rhythm of affection that required no explanation. Every so often their eyes would meet, and a soft smile would pass between them like a thread being pulled gently tighter. A wordless reassurance. "I'm still here. You're still mine." When they reached the cottage, Alara paused at the door. She glanced back once at the misty woods, then pushed the door open, the old hinges creaking a little in familiar protest. The warmth from inside wrapped around them instantly. The scent of firewood, dried herbs, and sleep clung to the air. She stepped out of her boots, he shrugged off his coat, and without a word, they moved back into that familiar space where night and comfort met. "I'll make tea," she said softly. "Do you still take it with honey and milk?" His voice was a murmur near her ear. "Only when it's your hands that make it." The kitchen hadn't changed in the slightest. The same chipped teacups on the shelf, the same copper kettle, the same little wooden drawer full of loose herbs. Calum stood close beside her as she worked, not saying much, simply watching. His hand occasionally grazed the small of her back, and once when she bent to reach the honey, he kissed the back of her neck, slow, warm, and impossibly tender. Alara's breath caught softly. "You used to do that every morning," she whispered. "You'd kiss me right there, and then pretend you hadn't." He kissed her again, lips softer this time, lingering longer. "I remember. I kissed you like it was my way of saying good morning to your soul." She turned to face him, the kettle forgotten for a moment. Her fingers found his shirt, gently tugging him closer. "You say things now that sound like poetry." "I've had a year of missing you to learn how," he said, brushing her cheek with the backs of his fingers. "You make everything worth saying slowly." When the tea was ready, they carried their cups to the sitting room and sat by the fire. Elara tucked her feet beneath her again, and Caleb settled beside her, stretching out slightly so that his arm could rest behind her. She leaned into him, one hand resting on his chest, the other wrapped around her mug. He took slow sips, occasionally setting his cup down to run his fingers through her hair, smoothing it back, tucking it behind her ear. Every touch was unhurried, every movement deliberate. There was no rush to anything, not the tea, not the fire, not the quiet that wrapped around them like another blanket. Outside, dusk melted into evening, and Elara reached for the matchbox on the shelf. "Let's light the candles," she whispered. "I want the kind of night that flickers." Together, they lit each candle, on the mantel, the windowsill, the little table by the couch. Golden glows danced into the corners of the room, replacing the soft light of day with something warmer, more intimate. When they sat back down, something about the room felt new, changed. Not because the candles were new, but because of the way Caleb's eyes kept finding hers in the quiet. "Elara," he said suddenly, voice so low it could have been the fire itself. "May I kiss your hands?" She blinked once, slowly, then extended both palms, open and offering. "They're yours." He took one hand in both of his, lifting it like something sacred. He kissed the inside of her wrist first, then each finger, one by one, letting his lips linger on the pads of her fingertips. Back in the cottage, the air felt softer, as if it had taken on the warmth of their closeness. The fire had dimmed into glowing embers, and the scent of rosemary and wood smoke drifted lazily through the rooms. Elara moved toward the kitchen with bare feet brushing the wooden floor, the oversized sweater slipping once again off her shoulder. Caleb followed, his eyes never leaving her, like he was afraid if he blinked, she might disappear again. But she didn't. She opened the little glass cabinet and pulled out two mismatched mugs, one pale blue, the other cracked ivory, and reached for the tin of tea she always kept near the stove. He stood behind her, so close she could feel his presence before she felt his touch. His arm slipped slowly around her waist, and his face dipped toward her neck. She stilled, closing her eyes as his lips brushed the skin just behind her ear. Slow, warm, and careful. Not to claim her, just to feel her, just to say, "I'm here. I missed this." Her hand rested lightly on his and she leaned back into him. "You always did like kissing me when I'm trying to make tea," she whispered. He chuckled softly, the sound vibrating against her spine. "Because you taste sweeter when you're half distracted." His fingers curled gently into hers, helping her steady the kettle, then stayed there, warm, grounding, safe. They moved through the morning like a dance. She made the tea. He buttered the toast. They brushed past each other slowly, eyes meeting, hands grazing, each touch filled with unspoken softness. The breakfast wasn't special, but the way he poured honey into her mug and kissed the corner of her mouth when it spilled made her heart ache in the most beautiful way. They sat at the little wooden table, knees touching, hands finding each other between sips. When she laughed at one of his stories, he leaned forward and kissed her laugh. When she looked away shyly, he touched her chin and kissed her gaze back to him. By the time they finished eating, the tea was cold and her heart was warm. The afternoon unfolded like a page turned slowly, full of pauses, small gestures, and the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. The rain had returned, only lightly, a soft tapping against the windows as if the world outside was content to whisper. Elara and Caleb curled up on the rug in front of the fire, a thick blanket thrown over their legs. She leaned into his side, head resting against his chest, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat. He traced lazy circles into her arm with his fingertips, and every so often kissed the crown of her head like he couldn't help it. They didn't talk about the past anymore, not directly, but their touches did. Every brush of her hand across his chest said, "I remember." Every soft kiss he placed on her shoulder said, "I'm sorry I left." And when their fingers locked together and didn't let go, it said, "We're not going to lose this again." He turned to her gently, his hand rising to cradle her jaw. "Alara," he said softly, "do you remember the first time I kissed you here?" She nodded, eyes never leaving his. "You were nervous. You asked me twice if it was okay." He smiled. "It still matters to me that it's okay, that you want me here." She leaned in, kissed him slow, longer this time. A kiss like a promise, like forgiveness, like the world could fall away and this moment would still hold. Their kisses deepened, but never hurried. Her lips parted slightly beneath his, and their breaths mingled in the space between. He cupped her face with both hands now, holding her like she was something precious. She slid closer, knees touching his, fingers threading through his hair. They kissed like they were still learning each other, even though their bodies had known this rhythm long before. The warmth between them built like the fire beside them, slow, glowing, intimate. She pulled back only slightly, resting her forehead to his. "Tell me you'll stay."